Hello everyone, and welcome to something a little different from the norm for The Trail Went Cold. You may have recently heard me announce that we are taking this week off and not releasing a new episode today, but we decided to fill in the void by dropping one of our exclusive bonus Patreon episodes into our feed instead. Ever since we launched on Patreon a year and a half ago, we have produced monthly bonus episodes for all of our patrons who have signed up with us in Tier 2, aka the Unexplained, or higher. This particular episode was recorded last summer and covers one of my pet cases, the 2001 murder of newspaper editor Kent Heitholt and the highly controversial subsequent convictions of Charles Erickson and Ryan Ferguson, the latter of whom has since had their conviction overturned and been released from prison. Most of our bonus episodes are not just your standard unsolved cold cases, and they usually have a unique twist to them. They include some of the cases which were featured as final appeal segments on Unsolved Mysteries, such as the convictions of Johnny Lee Wilson, Larry Race, and Jeffrey McDonald. I explore a few cases which are technically solved, but still have a few unanswered questions, and one of our earliest Patreon episodes was a retrospective on the life and career of the late, great Robert Stack. Anyway, today's episode is just a sampling of the type of bonus content you'll get if you sign up with us on Patreon in Tier 2 or higher, so hopefully you'll enjoy it, and if you decide to sign up, you'll get access to a number of exclusive episodes just like this one. All you have to do is visit us at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. So we'll see you again next week when we drop our next regular episode on September the 11th. November 1st, 2001. Columbia, Missouri. Kent Heitholt, a 48-year-old sports editor for the Columbia Daily Tribune, is severely beaten and strangled to death in the parking lot. 2.5 years later, investigators are led towards a young suspect named Charles Erickson, who has told people he had vivid dreams of himself and his friend, Ryan Ferguson, murdering Kent after leaving a nearby bar that night. After Charles confesses to the crime, both he and Ryan are charged with Kent's murder, and Charles's testimony helps convict Ryan and send him to prison for 40 years. However, after Charles and another key witness recant their testimony, Ryan's conviction is vacated, and he is released from prison in 2013. Even though many feel that Charles is also innocent of the crime, he remains incarcerated, and the exact circumstances of Kent Heitholt's murder are still unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's bonus Patreon episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be covering a case which has garnered a lot of notoriety these past several years. It involves the 2001 murder of a sports editor named Kent Heitholt, which led to the conviction of two young men, Ryan Ferguson and Charles Erickson. Only one of these suspects is still incarcerated, as Ryan's conviction has since been vacated, and he is a free man again. But even though Charles originally confessed to the crime and testified against Ryan, he has since recanted, and a lot of people believe that he is completely innocent as well. This is a story which wound up garnering a lot of attention on true crime shows like 48 Hours and Dateline, and it's not hard to understand why. Ryan Ferguson was just an ordinary kid from an ordinary family with no history of trouble with the law before he suddenly got charged with murder, seemingly because a friend of his had been telling stories of having dreams about them committing the crime together. As the years went on, it became apparent that this was one of the most terrifying wrongful conviction cases imaginable, because the actual hard evidence that Ryan committed this crime was non-existent, but he still wound up being sent to prison on some very questionable testimony. On a personal note, there is a reason I wanted to do an episode about this case. Back in May of 2013, I started writing true crime and mystery articles for listverse.com, and one of my earliest ones was 10 controversial convictions based on false confessions, which ranked the Ryan Ferguson, Chuck Erickson convictions at the top of the list. At that time, Ryan was still incarcerated, so imagine my surprise when the Free Ryan Ferguson Facebook page found out about my article and shared it there. I received a number of thanks from his supporters for putting his case into the spotlight, and it was just under 6 months later when Ryan's conviction was vacated and he was released. It was my first sign that maybe I should continue at this whole true crime thing. Things almost came full circle when I attended CrimeCon this year, and Ryan Ferguson himself appeared as a special guest, hosting his own session alongside Aaron Moriarty from 48 Hours to talk about his experience. Sadly, because I was at my booth on Podcast Row at that time, I did not get the opportunity to attend Ryan's session or meet him, but I think now would be an ideal time to do an episode about the crime which sent him to prison for 9 years. This episode is not going to spend much time debating Ryan's guilt or innocence, because I think the answer to that question is pretty obvious, but I also want to examine the potential involvement of Charles Erickson and the question of who actually committed this crime. So let us now explore the murder of Kent Heitholt. Our story begins in Columbia, Missouri in 2001. Our victim is 48-year-old Kent Heitholt, who works as the sports editor at the local newspaper, the Columbia Tribune. At around 2:26 a.m. on the morning of November 1st, police received a phone call from employees at the Tribune to report that Kent Heitholt was lying dead on the ground next to his car in the parking lot. He had been struck on the head 11 times with a blunt object before he was strangled to death. Kent had a number of defensive wounds on his fists to indicate he had fought back against his attackers. His belt was missing, but since its buckle was found on the ground, it seemed likely that the assailant had strangled Kent with his own belt. Kent's keys and watch were also missing, though his wallet was found on the front seat inside his car. There were 2 key eyewitnesses, Shauna Ornt, who worked as a custodian at the Tribune, and Jerry Trump, her supervisor. At around 2:21 a.m., Ornt claimed she'd stepped outside for a smoke break when she saw a white male ducking behind the driver's side door of Kent's car. Ornt went back inside to get Trump, and when they returned, Trump yelled over at the vehicle. 2 white males stood up into view, and one of them said, "Somebody's hurt," before they both took off down a nearby alley. Trump told police that he didn't get a good look at either of the 2 white males, but Ornt claimed that she got a clear look at one of them. He was described as being in his early 20s and having blonde spiky hair, so a composite sketch was made for him. There was a lot of physical evidence available at the murder scene, including unidentified fingerprints and shoe prints, and Kent had a strand of hair clutched in his hand which did not belong to him. In spite of this, the Columbia PD would be unable to turn up a solid suspect for the next 2 years. However, there would be an unexpected development when police were contacted by friends of 19-year-old Charles Erickson, who had heard him say some disturbing things about the Kent Heitholt murder. After a 2-year anniversary article about the case ran in the Columbia Tribune, Charles apparently started telling people that he had been having vivid dreams about being involved in the crime. When Charles saw the composite sketch of the unidentified white male from the parking lot, he was struck by how much he resembled him. You see, since the crime technically took place on Halloween night, Charles had spent the entire evening partying. By his own admission, Charles had issues with drugs and alcohol at that time. He had recently received probation on a marijuana charge and was smoking it 3 or 4 times per day. He spent Halloween night at a party and was under the influence of alcohol, Adderall, and cocaine before he hitched a ride with a friend of his named Ryan Ferguson to go to a local bar named By George. Even though Charles and Ryan were both only 17-year-old high school juniors, Ryan's sister knew the bouncer and ensured that he would allow them inside the bar. While there, Charles consumed more alcohol, but when he woke up the following morning, he claimed to have completely blacked out and had no memory of the previous night. 2 years later, Charles's drug and alcohol use had substantially increased, and he became legitimately concerned that he may have participated in Kent Heitholt's murder but did not remember it. Apparently, Charles's vivid dreams involved him and Ryan Ferguson committing the murder together, and he wondered if those were some sort of repressed memories. Charles even went so far as to share his concerns with Ryan at one point, but Ryan assured him these events did not happen and that his dreams had no basis in reality. Well, the Columbia PD seemed to think there might be something to Charles' story, so he was brought in for questioning on March 10, 2004. After being interrogated for hours and driven to the crime scene, Charles finally made a confession and provided a scenario for what happened. According to Charles, he and Ryan had run out of money while drinking at the By George bar, so Ryan came up with the idea of robbing someone to get some more cash. They left the bar together and eventually wound up in the Columbia Tribune parking lot, where they crossed paths with Kent Heitholt. After Charles hit Kent with a tire iron, Ryan proceeded to strangle him to death and rob him, before they both returned to the bar to purchase more drinks. On the basis of Charles's confession, Ryan was arrested, and both he and Charles were charged with murder. Of course, even after being interrogated, Ryan completely denied being responsible. He claimed that both he and Charles had left the bar together sometime between 1:15 and 1:30 a.m. before he dropped Charles off at his place and then went straight home. Nevertheless, Charles would eventually agree to a plea deal in which he would plead guilty to second-degree murder and testify against Ryan at trial in exchange for a 25-year sentence. More key eyewitness testimony would be provided by Jerry Trump, the custodian from the Columbia Tribune, who had since spent some time in prison because he was a registered sex offender who had violated the terms of his parole on a previous conviction for endangering the welfare of a child. As you recall, Trump had seen two white males leaving the murder scene, but initially told police he did not get a good look at him. But while he was incarcerated, Trump claimed that his wife had sent him a copy of a newspaper article about the arrests of Ryan Ferguson and Charles Erickson, and after looking at their photographs, he became convinced they were the same two young men he saw in the parking lot that night. The testimony from Erickson and Trump was enough to convince the jury, so on December 5, 2005, they found Ryan guilty on the charges of second-degree murder and first-degree robbery, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. So now we'll move on to one of the most remarkable aspects of this story, Ryan's father, Bill Ferguson. His incredible persistence is one of the major reasons this case has captured so much attention. Bill and Ryan always had a very close relationship, and he did not believe for 1 second that his son was guilty of this crime. So Bill made it his life's mission to prove Ryan's innocence and get him out of prison, and for the next several years, he would pretty much have to do all the investigative work on his own and go the extra mile to keep the story in the spotlight. Even before the conviction, there were major issues with the case, as none of the physical evidence from the murder scene, such as hair, blood, fingerprints, and DNA, matched Ryan or Charles. The video of the police's original interrogation of Charles showed that he did not reveal any details about the crime which were not already public knowledge after being shared in the media. And if Charles provided any details which were wrong, the police would correct him. As an example, Charles did not even seem to know Kent Heitholt's exact cause of death, as he initially guessed that he had been strangled with a shirt, or a rope, or a bungee cord, until one of the detectives told him it was a belt. It was apparent that investigators kept leading Charles on and feeding him details about the crime until he could put together a confession which seemed to fit the facts of the murder. But even so, there were still a number of things about Charles's confession which didn't make sense. Charles claimed that the primary motive was robbery, and that he and Ryan had returned to the By George bar after the murder to purchase more drinks. Well, the obvious problem with that is that Kent's wallet was left behind in his car, and the only items missing were his keys, watch, and belt. At trial, Charles tried to account for this discrepancy by claiming that Ryan later found a folded-up $20 bill which he had forgotten about. But there was a major hole in Charles's story which could not be explained. Because of requirement by state law and city ordinance, the By George bar closed every night at 1:30 a.m. This was nearly a full hour before Kent was murdered, so how exactly could Ryan and Charles have returned there to buy more drinks? There were multiple witnesses who could verify that the By George bar closed at 1:30 on Halloween night, and that Ryan and Charles had left together sometime between 1:15 and 1:30, but none of them were called to testify at trial. Charles had also shared a story about driving back to the bar from the murder scene with Ryan and stopping at a red light at around 2:30 a.m. alongside another car being driven by a friend of theirs named Dallas Mallory. They had a brief chat before driving off in separate directions. While Mallory denied that this exchange ever took place, and there were two crucial pieces of evidence to support this. Number one, Mallory's license had recently been revoked because of a DUI conviction, so he did not even drive or even own a car at this point. Number two, the particular intersection where this supposedly took place would not have had red lights at 2:30 a.m. While conducting his own investigation, Bill Ferguson noticed that because there was very little traffic at that time, this intersection always had flashing yellow lights during the early morning hours, so there would be no reason for two vehicles to stop together at a red light at 2:30 in the morning. When Bill put up a website in support of his son, asking people to come forward if they had information, he was eventually contacted by Shauna Ornt, the second custodian who was in the Columbia Tribune parking lot after the murder took place. Unlike Jerry Trump, Ornt initially claimed she had gotten a good enough look at one of the white males to provide details for a composite sketch. When Bill met up with her, she said she was absolutely certain that neither Ryan nor Charles was the young man she saw. Ornt also revealed that before the trial, the prosecuting attorney, Kevin Crane, had attempted to pressure and bully her into identifying Ryan as the perpetrator. Ornt refused to do this, so when she took the witness stand at trial, Crane made the calculated decision not to specifically ask her if she recognized the man she had seen in the courtroom. Consequently, Ryan's defense attorney, Charlie Rogers, also deliberately chose not to ask Ornt if she recognized the man she had seen, for fear that she might pick out Ryan. So even though Ornt had been called to testify, she was not given the opportunity to confirm or deny if the unidentified white male was Ryan. In 2008, Ryan was granted a new evidentiary hearing in which multiple witnesses were called to the stand to share new information which had not been disclosed at the original trial, but his motion for post-conviction relief was denied. Well, the case eventually captured the attention of noted attorney Kathleen Zellner, who specialized in wrongful conviction cases. Of course, Zellner has garnered a lot of attention these past few years after agreeing to represent Stephen Avery shortly after the release of the Making a Murderer documentary. Before that, she attained recognition for exonerating over 15 innocent defendants who had been convicted of crimes they didn't commit. Zellner agreed to take Ryan's case pro bono, and things eventually reached the point where literally the entire case against him completely fell apart. Charles Erickson sent Ryan a letter in prison asking for his attorneys to come speak with him. When Kathleen Zellner met up with Charles, he recanted his confession, and now claimed he had murdered Kent Heitholt on his own, and that while Ryan was present when it happened, he had attempted to stop Charles and did not participate in the crime. Well, obviously, since this new story still placed Ryan at the murder scene, it wasn't going to help his case too much, but Charles eventually came to see the light once he learned that Kevin Crane had flat out lied to him about several things before the original trial. Crane told Charles that Ryan was planning to plead guilty and implicate him in the murder, which was not true at all. It also turned out that Crane had provided Charles with falsified police documentation which said that Dallas Mallory was going to testify that he saw Charles near the murder scene that night. Charles was informed that he could potentially face the death penalty if he was convicted of first-degree murder, so he eventually buckled down and agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder and testify against Ryan. While Charles continued to maintain that he had blacked out and still had no memory of anything that happened on the night of the murder, he now felt certain that with no physical evidence placing them at the scene, neither he nor Ryan had any involvement in the crime. Charles was not the only one to recant his original story. When Bill Ferguson spoke with Jerry Trump's wife, she totally denied his claim that she had sent her husband a news article in prison containing Ryan and Charles's photos. She had shared this information with the prosecutor's lead investigator before trial, but this was never disclosed to the defense. When Trump was questioned about this again, he finally admitted that when he was released from prison on parole, he was approached by Kevin Crane, who pressured him into identifying Ryan at trial. Trump feared that refusing to do so might get him sent back to prison, so he went along with it, but now maintained his original story was the truth, and that he did not get a clear look at the two males in the parking lot. Based on this new information, a writ of habeas corpus petition was filed on Ryan's behalf, so he got another evidentiary hearing in circuit court in 2012. Even though they could have potentially faced perjury charges, Charles Erickson and Jerry Trump both took the stand to recant their original trial testimony. Kevin Crane, who had now become a circuit court judge, even appeared at the hearing to deny all the allegations of prosecutorial misconduct against him. Without the eyewitness testimony, there was literally no other evidence to implicate Ryan in the crime, but in spite of this, Cole County Circuit Judge Daniel Green denied Ryan's request for a new trial. In a cruel twist of fate, Judge Green announced his decision on October 31st, right before the 8th anniversary of the murder. This prompted Zellner to file a habeas corpus petition with the Missouri Western District Court of Appeals, alleging that the prosecution had committed numerous Brady violations by withholding key pieces of evidence from the defense. Well, the persistence finally did pay off. On November 5, 2013, the Court of Appeals ruled to vacate Ryan's conviction, and 1 week later, he was finally released after serving over 9 years in prison. Since the testimony from Charles Erickson and Jerry Trump was the entire crux of the prosecution's case against Ryan, and there was no other evidence to implicate him, the Attorney General of Missouri announced that he would not attempt to refile charges. Anyway, Ryan has since used his experience to become an advocate for the wrongly convicted, and at one point, he became the co-host of an MTV series about the subject called Unlocking the Truth. In addition to the extensive coverage it received on 48 Hours and Dateline, a documentary was produced about the case titled Dream Killer and released in 2015. But in spite of Ryan's exoneration, the case is still shrouded in controversy. Since he took a plea deal, Charles Erickson is still currently incarcerated and not eligible for parole until 2020. In spite of the fact that Charles's testimony landed him in prison, Ryan has publicly offered his support for him and hopes to get Charles exonerated and released as well. Ryan also filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against several different defendants who were responsible for his wrongful incarceration, and he was awarded an $11 million judgment last year. However, the one aspect of this case which often gets overlooked is the murder victim, Kent Heitholt. Even though Charles Erickson is technically still serving time in prison for the crime, many people believe that he had no involvement and that the real killer has continued to escape justice. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So as you well know, a number of high-profile murder cases have garnered attention these past several years over the debate about whether or not they were a wrongful conviction. Some of the examples include the West Memphis Three, Adnan Syed, Stephen Avery, Amanda Knox. In many of those cases, there is often heated debate about whether the defendants were innocent of the crime they were convicted of or guilty all along. But in the case of Ryan Ferguson, I don't think there's anyone who doesn't agree that a horrible injustice was done. I know that TV shows and documentaries about stories like this can often be slanted and have their own biases, but no matter how extensively you research Ryan Ferguson's conviction, there is just zero evidence that he actually committed this crime. All he really had was the confession from Charles Erickson and the eyewitness testimony from Jerry Trump, but since they both recanted their stories, the case against Ryan is literally non-existent. The guy was essentially railroaded on a murder charge because a friend of his had a bunch of weird dreams. I think one of the reasons this particular story has captured so much attention is because it shows just how easily this type of thing could happen to anyone. Sadly, Many victims who are wrongfully convicted happen to be minorities, or they come from an impoverished background, but Ryan was an average white kid from a respectable middle-class family who had a bright future ahead of him until he wound up spending nearly his entire 20s in prison. There was nothing in his background to suggest he would one day be implicated in a murder case. What's most terrifying is that this only happened because a friend of his whom he'd gone drinking with 2.5 years earlier just decided to tell the police that they'd committed murder together, and they conveniently ignored all the evidence which proved they didn't do it. I think I'm particularly attached to this case because I witnessed Ryan's exoneration unfold in real time. Like I mentioned in the intro, just under 5 months after I published that article on ListFirst, and it was shared on the Free Ryan Ferguson Facebook page, I was shocked when I logged in one morning and discovered that they had changed the title of the page to Freed Ryan Ferguson because his conviction was just vacated. It was also quite fascinating to see Ryan himself post on the Facebook page and interact with his supporters in the subsequent months in order to share what it was like to experience freedom for the first time in nearly a decade. It was crazy to think that Facebook was not even a thing at the time Ryan was charged with murder. Now, what's particularly remarkable about Ryan's trial is that during his opening statement to the jury, Kevin Crane flat out acknowledged that there was no physical evidence linking Ryan to the crime, but he told them that the evidence they did have was so compelling that he was confident the jury would still find him guilty. In many wrongful conviction cases, the defendant is exonerated by DNA testing, but that wasn't a possibility here, since everyone already knew from the outset that the DNA evidence did not match Ryan, yet it still did not matter. However, when I put myself in the jury's shoes and look at the entire trial from their perspective, I can still understand why they would have found Ryan guilty. Not only did an eyewitness place Ryan at the murder scene, but his alleged accomplice, Charles Erickson, testified on the stand that they committed the crime together. If you know that even after this confession, Charles is still going to be spending 25 years in prison, you're probably not going to think he's making this story up. When you watch the actual video footage of Charles testifying against Ryan at trial, he comes across as pretty believable at first glance. The defense countered by playing Charles's police interrogation tapes to show how his confession was manipulated by police, but the audio and video quality of the footage inside the courtroom was so poor that the jury couldn't really understand it. Even so, I think a good defense attorney would have been able to blow holes in Charles's story and convince the jury of Ryan's innocence, but it sounds like his lawyer, Charlie Rogers, was woefully unprepared. In the Dream Killer documentary, there's footage of Rogers showcasing aerial photos of downtown Columbia to the jury, and Crane is constantly pointing out how many details and locations Rogers gets wrong, and it's just painful to watch. Let's put it this way, if Bill Ferguson had represented his son at trial, Ryan probably never would have been convicted. Bill just seems like an amazing man, and the amount of legwork he did to keep his son's case in the spotlight and uncover new evidence supporting his innocence was remarkable. If you're ever convicted of a crime you didn't commit, you can only dream about having a father who will fight this hard to ensure you get out of prison. Now, Kathleen Zellner, I've had my issues with how she's handled things after taking on Stephen Avery as a client, and do not agree with a lot of the claims she's made in that particular case, but that doesn't change the fact that she's helped get a number of legitimately innocent people out of prison and did great work on Ryan's case. By the time Bill got in touch with her, he'd already spent a ton of money trying to get his son's conviction overturned without much luck, and if she hadn't agreed to take on Ryan's case pro bono, I'm not sure that ever would have happened. When Ryan was released, one of his first lines at the press conference was, quote, "As you can see, really, to get arrested and charged for a crime you didn't commit, it is incredibly easy, and you can lose your life very fast, but to get out, it takes an army." End quote. That's so true, because even after all the so-called evidence against him was completely debunked at the habeas hearing in 2012, Ryan still had to stay in prison for another year. I have no doubt that Judge Daniel Green's decision to deny Ryan a new trial was motivated by the fact that Kevin Crane was now a circuit court judge, and I'm sure Green didn't want to make waves by undermining a fellow judge's credibility. And speaking of Kevin Crane, He pretty much represents everything wrong with the justice system, as convicting Ryan provided a major boost to Crane's career and paved the way for him becoming a judge. Numerous people who dealt with Crane during Ryan's trial described him as being a major bully who would intimidate them into doing what he wanted, and I have not heard very many good things about him. Putting people like Crane in positions of power is pretty terrifying because in this particular case, he clearly knew that Ryan didn't commit the crime, but was willing to fabricate and withhold evidence in order to win at all costs. Even though Crane was one of the defendants named in Ryan's civil rights lawsuit, he was ultimately dismissed from the suit, so he is yet to face any consequences for all these allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. Sadly, in wrongful conviction cases such as this, the actual victim of the crime often gets overlooked. People are so busy trying to correct a terrible injustice and getting an innocent person out of prison that figuring out who the real perpetrator was becomes a secondary priority. Kent Heitholt left behind a wife and 2 teenage children, and by all accounts, he was a very likable, hardworking man. I can't imagine how tough it must be for Kent's family to believe they received closure when someone was convicted of his murder, only for the case to remain in the spotlight for the next several years, and for one of the people who supposedly committed the murder to walk out of prison. I have no idea if the Heitholt family still believe that Ryan and Charles are guilty of this crime, and I wouldn't blame them if they did, but it's got to be frustrating to think that no real effort is being made to conclusively solve this crime, because technically, one of the original perpetrators, Charles Erickson, is still incarcerated. When you look at the situation as a whole, it seems to defy all logic. The investigators and the prosecution presented a scenario which involved 2 defendants committing the murder, and the scenario has now been totally debunked, but even though one of the defendants is now out of prison, the other one is still there because he chose to plead guilty rather than go to trial. So is it possible that Charles Erickson could have actually murdered Kent Heitholt on his own without Ryan's involvement? Well, I seriously doubt it. The circumstances of how Charles wound up on the radar to begin with are pretty bizarre, and there was definitely good reason to investigate him after he started telling people about his fears that he committed the crime. It sounds like Charles was in a very bad place at that time because of drug and alcohol issues, so he may have genuinely thought he did it. The whole idea that you can experience a complete blackout and believe you committed a crime without even remembering is pretty terrifying. However, once investigators found out that Charles knew no details about the crime which weren't already public knowledge, and that none of the evidence matched his story, that should have been that. But the Columbia PD were under tremendous pressure to solve the case, and over 2 years had passed, so it seems like they had reached a point where they were going to use any shortcut possible to secure a conviction. Really, the only piece of evidence against Charles at all is his own confession, which he has since recanted, but none of the physical evidence from the murder scene, such as DNA, hair, fingerprints, and shoe prints, matches him at all, so there's really no way he could have been there. I seriously doubt that a guy could commit a brutal murder while on a massive bender of alcohol, cocaine, and Adderall without leaving any evidence behind. Now, Ryan and his supporters have made it very clear that they don't hold any animosity towards Charles for his actions, and believe that all the blame should be placed on the investigators and Kevin Crane, who lied to Charles and frightened him so much that he felt testifying against Ryan was his only option. All that really matters to them is getting Charles out of prison for a crime he didn't commit, but it sounds like it's a major uphill battle. Like I mentioned earlier, it was established right from the outset that there was no DNA evidence linking Ryan or Charles to the crime, so this can't be used as an option to exonerate him. Really, the best chance of clearing Charles's name is to find out who really killed Kent Heitholt, so that's what the rest of this episode is going to focus on. One of the most questionable aspects of the prosecution's case against Ryan is that the motive for Kent's murder was robbery. While I have my doubts that Kent just happened to cross paths with a random stranger in the parking lot who wanted to rob him, putting aside the fact that Kent's wallet was left behind in his car, his death did not fit the MO of a robbery, as he was hit over the head with a blunt object 11 times before he was strangled with his own belt. I honestly cannot think of any other case where a robber went to the trouble of removing their victim's belt and strangling him with it. That suggests that the crime was personal, and whoever killed Kent was unleashing a lot of rage and hatred. It was established that Kent logged off his computer inside the Tribune building at 2:08 a.m., and that Shauna Ornt first saw someone near Kent's vehicle at 2:21, so the crime had to take place within a very narrow window of time. So I guess now would be a good time to talk about the person who some people consider to be the prime suspect in this case, Michael Boyd. Boyd worked as a sports writer for the Tribune at that time, and Heitholt was his supervisor. Technically, he is the last known person to see Kent Heitholt alive, as he told police that they spoke briefly in the parking lot at around 2:20 a.m. before he drove away. Boyd agreed to be interviewed for the 48 Hours and Dateline episodes about this case, though he is not mentioned at all in the Dream Killer documentary. However, the civil rights lawsuit which was filed on Ryan's behalf listed a number of suspicious discrepancies involving Boyd. He apparently first learned about Heitholt's death when one of the detectives phoned him at home to interview him at 3:35 a.m. on the morning of the murder. Boyd claimed that after leaving the building, he spoke to another janitor in the parking lot for about 5 to 10 minutes until he saw Heitholt walk outside. Boyd went over to Heitholt and briefly spoke to him before he climbed into his car and drove away at 2:20. He claimed he did not see anyone else in the parking lot at the time he left. However, the following evening, Boyd was interviewed again by another detective, but details of his story changed. This time, Boyd never mentioned speaking to the janitor, and instead said that he left the building at 2:10, climbed into his car, and spent the next several minutes adjusting the radio. When he saw Heitholt exit the building, Boyd pulled up beside him in his car to speak briefly with him before driving away. This pretty much brought an end to the police's investigation of Boyd, as his DNA and fingerprints were never taken to test against the physical evidence found at the crime scene. But this wasn't the only discrepancy in his story. During his original statement, Boyd never mentioned anything about returning to the Tribune building after he left that night, but it would turn out that he could be seen in the background of a crime scene photograph peering out from behind a door. When questioned about this, Boyd did admit that he returned to the scene at around 4:30 a.m. after learning about Heitholt's murder. He said he saw Heitholt's body lying face down in the parking lot, and he remembered paramedics being there. Well, the problem is that the paramedics were long gone before 4:15, and even more troublingly, when the custodians originally found Heitholt's body, he was lying face down, but they turned him over to check on him, and he was lying face up by the time police arrived at the scene. There were also inconsistencies about what vehicle Boyd was driving that night. In 2005, Boyd told differing stories to both the defense and prosecution investigators, at first claiming that he drove his Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra, but then saying that he had driven his wife's Plymouth Acclaim that night. Boyd would also claim that he traded in his Cutlass Sierra in August of 2004, but all attempts to track it down have been unsuccessful. But here's the most suspicious piece of evidence which seems to point at Boyd. A schedule for the Hickman High School girls basketball team, along with some schedules and programs for Columbia College basketball, were found at the murder scene near Heitholt's body. Boyd's job at the Tribune was to cover high school and college athletics. Heitholt did not cover these subjects, so there was no real reason for him to be carrying these particular schedules and programs with him at the time he was killed. If that wasn't enough, it would turn out that Boyd and Heitholt did not get along that well, and that shortly before the murder, the two men had gotten into a dispute over a mistake Boyd made on one of his assignments. Shauna Ornt would also say that she frequently heard Boyd complain about the fact that Heitholt was very critical of his work. Within a year of the murder, Boyd would leave his job at the Tribune and move away. However, there's one big issue which likely prevented the police from looking at Boyd as a serious suspect. Boyd is African American, but two unidentified white males were placed at the murder scene right before Heitholt's body was discovered. So the way I see it, there are really only two possible scenarios here. Either Boyd is the perpetrator, and he fled the scene right before those two white males arrived, or those two guys committed the crime. And the only thing we know for sure is that it's very unlikely that the two white males were Ryan Ferguson and Charles Erickson. On the one hand, one of them was heard saying, "Somebody's hurt," which seems like an unusual thing to do if you've just committed a murder. But on the other hand, these guys left the scene and never came forward, even after the murder generated a ton of coverage in the local media and a composite sketch was published. Why would they do this if they had no involvement in the crime? If it was a robbery attempt, these two guys could have double-teamed Kent and attacked him as he was climbing into his vehicle. Even though Kent's watch was missing, it was just a cheap Timex which had no real value, and his wallet was left behind in his vehicle. Then again, once those two guys discovered that they had been seen by witnesses, they could have panicked and ran away before they had a chance to grab everything. However, that doesn't change the fact that Kent was struck on the head 11 times and strangled with his own belt. I have no idea if those two unidentified males knew Kent personally or not, but they would probably need to have an intense hatred of him in order to murder him in that fashion in a public parking lot. The one thing which points to these guys not being involved is the fact that neither Kent's belt nor the object used to club his head were ever found, and it doesn't look like Shauna Ornt or Jerry Trump remembered seeing them carrying anything as they fled the scene. The alternate explanation is that these two individuals just happened to stumble across Kent's body in the parking lot, got spooked and ran off when the custodians saw them, and decided they'd rather not get involved. There could be any number of reasons for that, even if these guys were completely innocent of the crime. This was Halloween night, so these guys could have been out partying and possibly partook in some underage drinking or illegal drugs. Hell, for all we know, they could have had some drugs on them at that time and decided they weren't going to stick around to speak to the police under those circumstances. When the composite sketch ran in the media, I'd be willing to bet they became terrified that they'd get blamed for the murder, which prevented them from coming forward and revealing that they were the two males in the parking lot. And all things considered, that might have been a wise move on their part. When you see how easily Ryan Ferguson and Charles Erickson were railroaded into being charged with a murder they didn't commit, the same thing could have happened to those two other guys, even if the evidence showed they didn't actually do it. In fact, it's possible that while checking Kent's body, they could have inadvertently left their fingerprints, shoe prints, and DNA at the scene, even though they didn't actually commit the crime. You also have to remember that Columbia, Missouri is a big college town. These guys could have been college students who graduated and moved away before Ryan and Charles were charged with the murder, and they were completely unaware of just how much this case would eventually blow up. Even if they're out there living their lives and are aware that two innocent people spent time in prison, they might still fear there will be major repercussions if they come forward, which is why they've remained silent after all these years. And here's another odd thing which points suspicion towards Michael Boyd. A few months after the murder, once it had been made public that police were looking for two white males, Boyd came forward to police and told them that he remembered seeing two white males walking down an alley a distance from the murder scene. The problem is that Boyd never mentioned this during his original interviews and stated that he didn't see anything suspicious in the parking lot. But even if Boyd was telling the truth, it's extremely unlikely that those two white males he saw in the alley were the same two men seen in the parking lot by Shauna Ornt, because she saw them there after exiting the building at 2:21 a.m., only a minute or so after Boyd claimed he drove away. So there's no way those two individuals Boyd supposedly saw could have made it to the parking lot and murdered Heitholt during such a narrow window of time that night. This once again demonstrates that if those two white males did not kill Heitholt, then the only other logical perpetrator is Boyd. If Boyd and Heitholt had a major dispute that night, this could have been Boyd's breaking point, causing him to just snap and fatally attack Heitholt in the parking lot. Granted, it seems like a major overreaction to murder someone in such a brutal fashion over a work disagreement, but Boyd was under a lot of stress at this time. He had been fired from his previous newspaper job for plagiarism. It doesn't sound like he was very well respected by his co-workers, and his gig at the Tribune was only a part-time one, so he was going through a number of financial difficulties trying to support himself and his family. If Boyd was responsible, and this was a crime of passion without any pre-planning, then this would explain some of the mistakes he made. For instance, if he was planning to make the crime look like a robbery, then this might be why he stole Kent's watch. But if he was paranoid about being discovered and left the scene in a hurry, he could have overlooked his wallet. If those schedules and programs from the basketball games found at the murder scene belonged to Boyd, then he easily could have dropped them during his frenzied attack, not even realized it until after he fled. Now, one thing which makes me wonder if Boyd is telling the truth is the fact that he willingly placed himself at the murder scene. He told investigators that he spoke with Heitholt in the parking lot right before he was killed, even though there were no witnesses who saw them together. If he was guilty, why would he place himself there like that? Well, I have to wonder if Boyd noticed those two white males as he was leaving and became paranoid that they would stumble upon Heitholt's body and tell police that they saw him driving away from the scene. In order to account for this, Boyd had to fabricate a cover story about leaving the parking lot at 2:20 a.m. in order to explain his presence there. But since the two males were never identified or came forward to the police, Boyd's cover story ultimately became unnecessary. Overall, I think the one thing which leans me towards Boyd being the perpetrator is the very tight timeline. Boyd says he drove away from the parking lot at 2:20, and Shauna Ornt first saw a white male crouching down outside Heitholt's vehicle at 2:21. This suggests that the murder had already taken place by the time Ornt exited the building. So if Boyd is completely innocent, then that means that those two white males had to show up at the scene right after he left and murder Kent in a span of around 1 minute or so, which just doesn't seem physically possible. If Kent was shot to death, then that would be one thing, but I have to think that using a blunt object to strike someone's head 11 times before removing their belt and strangling them to death with it is something which would take a bit of time. And since Kent had defensive wounds on his fists and an unknown hair clenched in his hand, this seems to indicate that he also fought back against his attacker. The window just seems too narrow for a scenario like that to have taken place. When you consider that the strained relationship between Boyd and Heitholt wasn't much of a big secret at their workplace, it seems quite astonishing that the Columbia PD did not investigate Boyd more thoroughly during the 2-year period in which this murder was unsolved. I think we can probably chalk this up to a case of tunnel vision. Once those two young white males were placed in that parking lot, the police were probably convinced that they were the perpetrators, which might be why they didn't consider a middle-aged African-American man like Boyd to be a good suspect. But in the end, they put a lot of effort into fabricating a story to railroad Ryan and Charles for this crime, when it's possible that all they really had to do was collect Boyd's DNA, fingerprints, and hair, and compare them to the physical evidence from the murder scene. I think that's the most frustrating thing about where this case stands today. If Boyd is the killer, then this is easily solvable because there's enough physical evidence to incriminate him. If Boyd is innocent, and those two white males are responsible for the murder, then at the very least, DNA testing could exclude Boyd, and they can move on to exploring other leads. But it sounds like the authorities are not going to do this because they don't want to admit that a colossal mistake was made. Even after Ryan's conviction was overturned, Kevin Crane continued to maintain that he believed Ryan was still guilty and that they got the right people all along. And since Charles Erickson is still incarcerated for the crime, I think the authorities technically still consider the case to be solved. I guess you can call this a horrible catch-22. The best chance for solving Kent Heitholt's murder is for Charles to be exonerated and released. But since none of the physical evidence matches Charles, the only thing which can really be done to prove his innocence is to catch the real killer, which the police don't want to do since Charles is still in prison. It's quite a nightmarish situation for everyone involved. All that being said, if you happen to have any information on who actually murdered Kent Heitholt, please visit the website freecharleserickson.org for all the appropriate contact info. So that about wraps up this month's Patreon exclusive bonus episode. Even though I often like to cover lesser-known cold cases on The Trail Went Cold, I think Patreon is a good place to take the opportunity to examine the more high-profile cases like this one. And since I kind of have my own 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon connection to this story 5 years ago, and consider this to be one of the cases I'm most obsessed with, I thought this would be an ideal time to explore it. So let's hope that Ryan Ferguson continues fighting the good fight and advocating for the wrongly convicted, that Charles Erickson is eventually exonerated and released from prison, and that the real killer of Kent Heitholt is finally brought to justice someday. So thanks to everyone for listening, and join me in August for our next exclusive bonus Patreon episode of The Trail Went Cold.